Hi, welcome back. It's another day in New York City. Just to recap, yesterday, the British have now total control of all of Long Island and Staten Island. George Washington and his troops are in the New York City in the southern half down here. And everything's kind of quiet for a couple days. So I thought I would talk about some events and some people. So one event that I didn't mention earlier is that during August, late July or August, the British sent 2 ships up here just to see how far they could get without any problems. And they stayed on the west side of the Hudson. And so they came up like this, and the American batteries were just firing away. And that kind of leads us into a quote that I want to give you. There was a young man, 15-year-old farm boy, Joseph Plum Martin from Connecticut. And young Mr. Martin, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, convinced his grandparents to sign for him to join the militia. And he joined the Connecticut militia, and he arrived in New York City in June of 1776. And this is what he had to say. And he was quoted. He was an interesting guy. He stayed throughout the entire war, lived to be 89, and wrote a book quoting a lot of his diaries and stuff that he had done during the war. And it's interesting reading from a first-hand account. So this gentleman writes about Private Joseph Martin, the 15-year-old Connecticut recruit, would remember enjoying, quote, a complete view of the whole affair. It was his first experience with the muttering of cannon fire, and he rather thought the sound was musical or at least grand. So this is July of 1776. So just remember that. He thought it was musical. So now we get down to this little circle with the X in it. And we had talked about this very briefly. I said we would talk about it in the very first show that we did. So this is the HMS Eagle. It's the flagship of the British fleet, and Admiral Howe was on board. That's where he's staying. And so there was a gentleman who invented the first submarine, which I thought was interesting. His name was Bushnell, and he lived right here in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. He was a Yale graduate, and he loved to play with gunpowder. And he invented torpedoes, he invented floating bombs, and all kinds of stuff. Well, he invented a one-man submarine, and it was called the Turtle. And what they did is they launched out of here, and the Turtle went up alongside the Eagle, and it kind of floated mostly below the water, but there was just a little bit, and it was hand powered. You cranked it like this, and the way that they attached, they had the kegs of gunpowder were on the outside, and they would be attached to the hull of the Eagle. What they didn't count on was that the Eagle had a metal coating on the outside of it. They put metal plates on the outside to keep the worms out. The boring instrument would not bore through the iron, and so they had to stop, and he went back. The Turtle was lost at sea in a battle, and no one knows where it is. There is a replica of the Turtle, a real-life replica. There's one at the Essex Maritime Center in Essex, Connecticut, and there's also one at the Naval Submarine Museum right here in Groton, Connecticut. So if you ever want to see what the first submarine looked like, that's it. So on September the 9th, down here in Lower Manhattan, George Washington calls a council of war, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And so all of the generals want to retreat. The only way to go is this way. And so Washington really wants to take the battle to him, but he's convinced, okay. So Washington and about 2/3 of the Continental Army, they go up to this place over here called Harlem Heights. It's a high piece of land. It's got Fort Washington is just above it, and it's got good protection. And so that's where he goes. So the British realize this, and so they devise a plan where they're going to come up the East River very hard against the current, but they make it. They come up against the East River, and they're going to attack this way and circle behind this way. And General Putnam is down here. He's also from Connecticut, and he says it's time to get out of Dodge. And so he wants to retreat. So he comes up here. He has to follow. He's following the road up here. These green lines are roads. He's following this road up, and so that's his plan: is to come up here and then to go like this and get up into. So the British, they sail up with a number of troops and some ships and stuff, and they sit right off this place called Kip's Bay, and so. They wake up on the morning of September the 16th, and there's some Connecticut infantry in here, about 500 guys total. Putnam has started his march up this way to get up to Harlem Heights, and the British start bombarding Kip's Bay. And so I want to tell you that. I'm going to find Mr. He wrote, so Mr. Plum Martin, Joseph Plum Martin, wrote in his diary, quote, "All of a sudden there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping," meaning the battleships, "that I thought my head would go without sound. I made a frog's leap for the ditch and lay as still as possible I could and began to consider which part of my carcass would go first. Change of heart in just like 2 months. Now he's terrified of the guns." So he was a character. He was actually kind of comedic in some of his diary entries, but very, very interesting. So anyway, so these 500 guys, they start coming out because they're retreating. Now the problem is Putnam's coming this way. The British have landed. And we have this crucial intersection right here. See, Putnam's plan is to go this way, away from the British. The British plan is to come down this road and block him in. Putnam's got 3,500 guys, about a third of the Continental Army with him. The British have about 7,000 men that have landed. So out in the lead of the British thing is General Clinton. He's followed by General Howe. And they get to right about here, about a mile from this intersection, and they come across Mary Murray. And now, Miss Murray is a wife. Her husband, Robert, is a loyalist. She is on the revolutionary side. That must have been interesting dinner room conversation, if you ask me. But anyway, he's not home. They're famous for their parties. They throw these lavish parties like you wouldn't believe. So anyway, Mary understands what the problem is. She knows that Putnam's coming this way. She knows the British are coming this way. She runs out and she invites General Clinton to a tea party. And believe it or not, the British stop a mile from this intersection. They stop and they have a party. They have wine and cheese and cake, and General Howe comes, and everybody's having a good time. And while the British Army is sitting a mile from the intersection, General Putnam is sliding by and going up. Had she not had that party, we would have probably lost the war right there. But just one of the many women that was influential in one act, many acts, whatever you want to call it. She threw a party, which she was famous for, stopped the British, let the Americans get by. They went up, and the day was done. So I want to encourage, there's this book out there, because believe it or not, women were a vital part of the Revolutionary War. From Abigail Adams to Molly Pitcher to Mary Murray to all kinds of ladies were influential. We're going to get to one of my favorite 14-year-old girl. does a better job than Paul Revere. Sybil Luddington makes a ride. We'll talk about her later on. So just throughout the war, and you have to remember that the wives, a lot of the wives accompanied their husband. So when you're moving, we'll say 4,000 soldiers, you may be moving 4,000 soldiers and 1,000 wives, because they just kind of followed. They were called camp wives, and so that was throughout. So there's this book, Women Heroes of the American Revolution. I encourage you to read it. It's very informative and has some great stories in it. Thank you very much for today. We will see you on Monday morning with the Battle of Harlem Heights. Thanks. Have a good night. Enjoy your Sunday.